Hello everybody, welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we're doing a box office preview for this upcoming weekend, which sees Joker 2 get completely annihilated by everything seemingly coming out this weekend, or at the very least, just Terrifier 3, with a also strong showing from The Wild Robot. In the case of Terrifier 3, I can say I've never really had an interest in that franchise, but it clearly has a fan base, and for how little they typically are spending on those movies, it's looking to make some pretty easy profits. All the while, The Wild Robot is expected to come in at a very strong second place, at least according to Box Office Theory. So we'll talk about that. Also, the new films coming out this weekend and just how much of a drop-off we should expect for Joker 2. And let's just say it is not looking good at all. So starting off first over on Box Office Theory, diving into these numbers first with Terrifier 3. Right now, the traditional tracking on the film is saying it's going to make around $10 million or more. Now, I have myself never seen the Terrifier films, but as I mentioned in the very beginning, they typically come from a low-budget horror fare, and so there's clearly a lot of people that like not only horror films, but also like the more low-budget horror films because they seem to be a bit more on the campy side of things. In this case, it's much more of a slasher-type, gore-fest, body horror-type expression of filmmaking from what I have been told about the franchise at the very least. And so clearly there is a market for that kind of content, and it seems that they're going to be turning out for this film in quite a big way because even according to Box Office Theory, not only do they expect it to make over $10 million, they're projecting it to make between 11 and 19 million. And the fact that Terrifier 3 right now is expected to come in the #1 spot at the box office this weekend after a film like Joker 2, a $200 million budgeted movie, versus Terrifier 3, which last I checked typically comes from a franchise that has not cost more than maybe $1 million, if even that. I know that at one point, one of the films was under $1 million as far as the overall budget. So let's see if we can actually pull this up in real time. Yeah, $2 million budget. So very, very small. In comparison to some of the other films in the franchise, obviously a little bit more because Terrifier 2 cost only $250,000, which is kind of amazing. And then Terrifier, the original, cost only $35,000 to $55,000. So clearly they were able to find enough of an audience for this movie, for this franchise, where they've actually seen a exponential amount of growth, right? So to be able to go in your box office from $416,000, obviously not really a well-known commodity at that point, likely became known through either physical media sales or because it got picked up by maybe one of the horror channels, one of the horror streaming services that can sometimes pick up these lower budgeted horror films. But somehow it was able to, pick up some audience there because at the second film, they were able to up the budget to $250,000 and then it made $15.7 million. This is a film that I remember even hearing about when this came out back in 2022, because there was even people in my comment section saying, hey, talk about Terrifier, talk about this, because this is amazing. And it got nominated even for some Raven Awards here on the channel for Best Low-Budget Film of the Year. And again, not really my cup of tea, but clearly there are a lot of people that are indeed quite fond of it. And so the fact that they were able to now up it once again to $2 million of a budget, this bodes well very much for the film. Again, the last film was able to get around $15.7 million, and so one would suspect that if it's going to have an opening weekend of close to $11 to $19 million, that this movie should theoretically add on to that audience. And so I think that based off of where the film has been tracking just as a franchise, I think it's going to do it. And Box Office Theory seems to have a lot of high hopes for this movie as well, and they're not the only ones either. Even Box Office Pro currently has the film set to make also between $12 and $18 million. And so I will be very interested to see where Box Office Report falls on this, but I imagine that they will probably also have this movie in the #1 spot because really there isn't a whole lot coming out this weekend. If we go over to thenumbers.com, not only do we see the massive and catastrophic drop-off that Joker 2, Joker Folie à Deux, had on Monday, where it dropped 70% from the day before, right? To go from a Sunday to a Monday with that kind of a drop-off, with that low of a box office opening, that is not good. And though it was able to pick that back up on Tuesday, it was not able to pick it up by much, right? To discount Tuesday makes more sense that more people are going to see your movie on a Tuesday than on a Monday, but only able to increase that by 45%. I think that speaks volumes there. And then it did not last long either because then it dropped 51% on Wednesday and actually made room for The Wild Robot. Now, it didn't beat it by much, but the fact that The Wild Robot in 13 days of release was able to beat the 6th day of release of Joker 2 just speaks to how bad Joker 2 is, and how poorly received it is, and how bad the word of mouth has been, and also ultimately how much of a box office flop the film is going to be. But as I mentioned, right, this is not going to be that big of a weekend. You have a film called The Apprentice that, yeah, you might have some TDS people go out of their way to go see because they want to see a film that's going to mock Donald Trump in some way, because there are people that are obsessed with that kind of stuff. Honestly, I'm amazed that it got picked up by any of these companies, because apparently a lot of people, even in Hollywood, were like trying to stay away from this movie as far as directing and as far as actual release of the film, but Briarcliff was able to get it out. Briarcliff, by the way, is typically only known for being the studio that is ultimately single-handedly keeping Liam Neeson's action career alive. I feel like they put out at least 2 to 3 Liam Neeson movies every single year, and they're all generally the same, and they're all trying to push him as some type of action hero in some way. And so the fact that that's the same company doing The Apprentice, yeah, it doesn't really bode well, I think, for the movie. And as I mentioned, the only people really interested in seeing a movie like that are going to be crazy people. And these crazy people that have TDS typically don't go see movies. They typically don't spend a lot of money. They like to complain and whinge on Twitter and social media, but they really don't do much else than that. So don't expect that film to be anywhere in the discussion. My Hero Academia from Toho International. We have an anime that obviously there's always that dedicated go-to anime audience. They're not the largest in the world as far as, or at least they're not the largest in North America. They don't make the big bucks really here, but they still are a dedicated bunch. And so there's going to be a pretty standard amount of people that will show up for that. And so that will definitely be in the top 10 discussion, at least. Piece by Piece. Never heard of that. Have no idea what that is. In fact, let's go ahead and open that up in a tab and see if maybe the thing. Oh, that's right. Piece by Piece. Okay, so yeah, this is the story of Pharrell, the musician, the artist, I should say, and it's all told through Lego. So yeah. Who knows? Maybe that film is able to reach out to some people. It is in the concept of Lego, and so I would imagine that the film would have to be PG. Yeah, PG for language and some suggestive material and lyrics. So maybe that will be able to drive out some kids, but I don't think it's going to be nearly as much success as the Lego Batman movie, because this is just a Lego story, basically almost like a Lego documentary, it seems. I don't think that's going to be enough to drive out a lot of people, but hey, it's an interesting concept, so kudos to them for thinking about it. Terrifier 3, as I mentioned, from Cineverse, is expected to get that #1 spot very easily, and then the film Saturday Night is expanding. This film had a limited release. I was actually able to see this movie, and overall, it's a decent film. It deals with the final moments, like the final hour or hours before the first episode of Saturday Night Live premiered back in 1975, and it is, I think, the most interesting thing about it is the actors that are portraying people like Chevy Chase and many of the others, Dan Aykroyd, so many of the other people that are members of the original cast of Saturday Night Live. And I think some of the impressions hit really, really well. Some of them hit more like just really bad impersonations. But yeah, I think there is still enough in there where a lot of people, or I think enough people will find something to like about it, but it's not going to be a big moneymaker. I mean, again, this is much more of a niche thing. Doesn't have any real big actors in it necessarily, right? There are bigger people being portrayed than people who are actually in the movie itself, but there is still a pretty good cast of comedic actors in there. And so I do think that if you like Saturday Night Live, if you like the old school Saturday Night Live, and if you like some of the actors in the list of the film, if you look that up for yourself, then I would say you might actually enjoy it. Now, there is, I think, a joke that goes a little bit too far that deals with, let's just say it deals with Christ, and it's a bit blasphemous, and yeah, probably a bit over the line. And again, I know that some people think that comedy should have no limits, but I would disagree and say, no, there clearly should be limits to pretty much anything. Like, that would be trying to argue that there should be no limits on anything, and clearly there should be, especially from a moral lens. But as I mentioned, I think that a lot of people will probably find some enjoyment there. I gave it a decent score, about a 50% score for me. Shout out to you, Gary Badger Sandwich Worthington, though my score was absolutely not a perfect 50. I digress. Terrifier 3, though, is the big story. Again, expected to be a massive, massive win this weekend. As you can see, some key things that Box Office Theory is tracking there. It says, continues to impress in pre-release social and pre-sale models as fans of the niche franchise are sending existing showtimes to near capacity. The key variables driving volatility at this stage will be much further beyond that core audience that film can reach, as well as how many more showtimes and screens exhibitors will be willing or able to allocate given the somewhat crowded new release marketplace and the brand's own hard R content. The one thing I will disagree there is the fact that they're trying to point out that there's a new release marketplace of films. But as I just mentioned, there really isn't a whole lot of new releases coming out this weekend as far as ones that would be able to bring a lot of people out. They're not coming from major distributors either. So it's not like you have a Disney coming out with a new film where they're going to be able to kind of, hold theaters to a certain degree accountable and rather, that's not even the right expression. They're really going to be able to kind of, they have a vice grip on theaters essentially, right? For those that don't know, the way that Disney typically works is to say, oh, you want to show our movie? Okay, we'll give you the pleasure of showing our film, but you have to be able to follow these specific rules. You have to have X amount of show times in the premium time slot, right, of between 6 and 8 p.m. You have to have X amount of 3D showings. You have to have X amount of these showings. And if you don't have that, you don't get our movie. And it's pretty crappy, to be honest. So when I worked at a theater, it was always rough whenever a new Disney film came out because there was always these rules that we had to follow just to be graced with the presence of getting their films. I think that they lost a little bit of that power when COVID hit, and obviously when they started putting out just bomb after bomb after bomb. But I imagine they still had that power. Not really the same thing can be said for any of the distributors here on this list. Obviously, we think that Sony is a pretty big name here, but this is also a limited release. And so even though it's expanding wide, that is still not going to be really enough, I think, to be able to push a lot of theaters necessarily to put that as a prime spot or piece by piece. So I think ultimately Terrifier 3 probably has, especially because of that word of mouth and because of the fact that their audience is pretty much a guaranteed audience in many ways. If those pre-sales are good, then I think that, yeah, you'll probably end up seeing that do quite well there. It goes on to say, among other openers, Saturday Night Live is likely to stand out as it expands into wide release with strong reviews and early Oscar buzz on its side. Still, the prestige drama market has been challenged in post-pandemic times as older audiences have more gravitated towards streaming for certain types of films. Yeah, ultimately, this is going to be geared towards older audiences. And as we've talked about with older audiences, they just do not show up for movies, especially for films that, as I said, it's a decent movie, it's fine, but it's nothing to write home about. It's nothing that anyone's going to miss. I think more people would rather watch old episodes of Saturday Night Live and see the actual comedic legends do their thing than see people portraying those legend comedic actors, right? So I think that it might be a little bit of a miss there as far as the analysis, but ultimately it is, again, something that has entertainment value, and so that might be enough to maybe get it to be higher than what I would have expected. Going to the full chart, though, as you can see, Terrifier 3 right now projected to get $14.1 million, so that would clearly be a huge win for it. Just like I was predicting last weekend, I said that Wild Robot probably would be in the discussion for the top spots. Did not expect this amount of money for Terrifier 3, and so Wild Robot is still going to be up there. $14 million, a 26% hold from last weekend. Was finally able to see the Wild Robot just the other day, and it is it's just a breathtaking movie. It honestly has some of the best animation that I've seen in quite a long time. Very unique, does not follow the tropes of a lot of modern day animation, I think to its betterment. And not to mention that it has also just a very simple, straightforward, and solid story about family and about the role of mothers especially, but just the role of parents and what parents have to go through when their kids grow up and all of the hardships of that and all of the things that happen within that relationship. And I thought that was very interesting. And the voice cast is also phenomenal. They all do a great job. It's been getting rave reviews from audiences and critics alike, and I would say it's a film that is well worth seeing. That movie, as I mentioned it being in the discussion here, only dropping 26% after a few weeks of release. This is still holding very strong. I do suspect that this film will be able to make some money back by the end of its run. I think it's going to get well over $100 million domestic by the end of its run, and I think that's going to be a very good sign for it. Really, the question is going to be, does it do anything international? As of right now, the international is not doing too big of a number, and there was no update. As I said, it might be the case as of last weekend. The internationals that we had at the end of last weekend were actually the final ones, but still, I think this movie is one that should be watched. Can't say the same thing about Joker, right? So obviously with Wild Robot and Terrifier 3 battling it out for first and second place, kind of a crazy combo of films going after that. Joker 3 is expected then to drop to third place. And I would actually argue that there's a chance that Joker might even make less than the $9.4 million it's projected to make, right? Right now, Box Office Theory is projecting the film to have a 75% drop from last weekend. So they're expecting around 9.4. Over on Box Office Pro, they are projecting between 10 and 15. So they have a much rosier picture for Joker, but even if it gets that 10 to 15, that's still quite a large drop. They then think The Wild Robot will come in third place, and that will battle out with Saturday Night's battle, or rather, its further wide release. I would disagree, though. I think probably closer to Box Office Theory's way of thinking that Saturday Night's probably going to get single digits there, like only about $5.8 million, maybe a max of 6.4. So the weekend forecast being 5.8, and then its update, because it had a limited release last weekend, would be around 6.6. Again, still a limited release, though, at around 2,000 screens. So that's why, as I mentioned before, it's not going to expand wide enough to get into most people's markets. But even if it does get into your market, I don't really think the buzz for this movie is there. And it's the kind of movie that you would, again, maybe see, hey, it's gotten all the critics' praise and awards praise, but that doesn't mean anything in today's market, right? If regular, everyday people, if the younger audiences are not going to see a movie or not having that word of mouth campaign for the film, it doesn't matter if your film is good or not. It's just not going to make a lot of money. So yeah, I would say leaning a lot more towards that Saturday night number. Would not be surprised if that Saturday night number came in actually lower than was being projected here. But I do think that Beetlejuice, 7.5 million, dropping 26%, again, still holding very strong there. I could see there is a universe out there where I think Beetlejuice could actually end up beating Joker, and Joker being pushed down to the number 4 spot potentially. So it'll be an interesting battle to see even in that instance. But yeah, Joker flopping very, very hard at this point. Can't say I'm not surprised by it, right? This movie was a giant FU to the fans, was a giant middle finger essentially to the fans of the first movie. And guess what? Fans actually do care. And because the market is so much more volatile today, it's so much easier to get a message out about whether a film is good or not, about whether a film is paying respect to source material, or in this case, fans. Yeah, guess what? No one's going to see this film once, let alone twice. Well-deserved flop here from everyone involved with the project. My Hero Academia expected to come in the next spot after that, $4 million there. So again, that sounds about right for that type of movie here in North America. Transformers 1 still holds around, but as I mentioned, just not making money. The Apprentice only expected to make $3 million. Would not be surprised if this film came in well underneath that number either, right? It's getting a limited release, and as I mentioned, you're only going to have the crazy people out there with TDS who are actually going to want to see this movie, and a lot of them don't go to see movies and don't spend money. So don't be surprised by that. Piece by Piece, surprisingly, only at $2.9 million. And again, it is a limited release. It is a documentary, and so it's probably why it's tracking lower. It'll be interesting to see if the whole Lego dynamic actually pushes more family audiences out with it, even though it is a documentary, that maybe because there are the figures, right, of Legos in the movie, maybe that could be enough to actually have some more people, especially in the family demographic and having young kids demographic, bring them out just to have that. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see where that falls. Wouldn't surprise me either way in that case. And then Speak No Evil, rounding out the chart for them, and it's just the top 3 over Box Office Pro. Box Office Pro has kind of fallen by the wayside over the past several years. Now, we do love Chatsy on OMB Reviews, and so let's go ahead and get into some of that charting here for us. Get up this chart here. We like to do things in real time as well. So remember, the opening weekend worldwide for Joker, Folie à Deux, was around $121 million. It actually made less domestically by the end of its when the final numbers updated over the weekend, because it came in around only 37 million domestic, where the initial estimates were 40 million, and that was after it being a lot worse than that. So as of right now, it's around $121 million worldwide. So once those internationals come in, international is showing up a lot more for this movie than the domestic market. It wouldn't surprise me to see this film, maybe miss out on $200 million. And again, I have to say that because international, honestly, is a huge question mark. But let's say, for the sake of argument, it does somehow get to $200 million by the end of this weekend. If that happens, I need to add one more zero here. Let's do this in real time. If that happens, then the projections I would have for the movie would be a worst-case scenario of $285 million worldwide. I could see that happening, and maybe even coming in less than that, with a best-case scenario being of $400 million. That means an average showing around 342. That would mean also you're looking at losses around $128 million to around $94 million. Now remember, this film has to make a lot more than a 2.5 multiplier, right? Because we know as a fact now that this film is not making money domestically. And that means it's making much more money internationally, where it gets a much smaller cut. Because it's getting a much smaller cut in that international and from that international market, we do have to recognize and to realize that means that this film is going to be a much bigger flop than even what these current numbers indicate. I would not be surprised if by the end of its run, we're talking about a $150+ million flop. As of right now, with the numbers that we have, it's at $243 million in losses because of how it's bleeding money domestically. If that same type of bleeding happens this weekend internationally, and again, we won't know until those weekend numbers come in from the international market. If we see something similar, though, we're talking about a film that could be between $150 and $200 million in financial losses. And yeah, can't say I'm surprised, and couldn't have happened to a nicer film. Another flop, obviously, Megalopolis is still indeed flopping. We, of course, don't have the strongest numbers for The Wild Robots international take, but domestically, it's doing very well. The fact that it'll again be able to add some more money, well over $10 million again this weekend, will continue to chip away at those losses. I do suspect that by the end of its run, it will be a success, and I do think it has a chance of being similar to what we saw with Puss in Boots, The Last Wish, where that film didn't have the best openings in the world, didn't even have the best couple of weeks in the world, but because it legged out for as long as it did, was able to make a decent amount of profit. I suspect that The Wild Robot could be the same. And if not, then I would at least hope that would be the case, because it really honestly is a great film that I think is well worth seeing. But let's say that maybe a worst case scenario happens and the film Joker 2 only gets to $180 million. Let's see what that would mean for it. That would mean only 257 to 360, which mean 145 to 84 million in losses. And I don't have to really tell y'all that, yeah, that we're talking again about $150 million likely in potential losses for this movie. And yeah, it's not looking good at all for it. And so those are the numbers currently as they stand. We'll do one last update here of some of the other films some people might be interested in. So right now, Transformers 1, at least the numbers that we have right now. Let's see if we can update this in real time, because sometimes those numbers have to be updated. Apparently it does not want to work in any way. So it is what it is. But what are y'all's thoughts on these movies? As you saw there, Transformers 1, though, is still a flop, as are many of the other films on this list. Let me know your thoughts about this and anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below. Do you think that we're going to see Terrifier 3 take that #1 spot? Right now, it seems to be tracking as such. I wouldn't be surprised to see Wild Robot upset Terrifier 3. It's kind of weird to say it that way, because it's an upset no matter what when Terrifier 3 gets into even the top 3 at the box office. Where do you think Terrifier 3 is going to land? Do you think Wild Robot's going to have a strong showing as well? And also, do you think Joker 2 is going to have an even bigger drop-off than City 5? I wouldn't be surprised to see it drop in the 80s, to be perfectly honest. Like, I've never seen such a terrible reaction to a movie before, especially for a film that is a sequel to a very successful, very financially successful, as well as everything else, movie in the first Joker film. So Joker Folie à Deux, how big of a drop do you think it's going to be? How big of a flop do you think it's going to be? Let me know your thoughts about that and anything else I mentioned in the comments down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, loud that fire button over in Aussie, smash the rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your night, a blessed Thursday, and as always, God bless. And now for a huge special shout out to all of my Chosen of Valhalla members, starting off first with my people on Patreon, Father Luca Illick and Miss Martin Muses. Check out her YouTube channel by the same name, Miss Martin Muses. Also to my Subscribe Star people, Matt317. Check out his Twitch channel by the same name, Matt317. And also to the K-Man. Check out his website, xtheboundaries.co. And lastly to my YouTube member, Mr. Roy. Shout out to you, good sir. And if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, check out the top link in the video description below where you get access to that. Also, you get access to a plethora of other things. You get your name listed at the end of every live stream and video, like you saw in those names that came up before this video started. And also access to a giveaways channel that I host over on the Discord server where I give away 4Ks, Steelbooks, Blu-rays, all kinds of stuff. So check that out if you're interested in that. Also, I have an exclusive podcast that I hold at least once a month, and it's always a good time, and you get extra bonus content with that also. So if any of that sounds interesting, again, check out that top link in the video description below. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, God bless.